Hi everybody and welcome back. I hope you had a really great lunch and enjoyed yourselves and got some great networking in. My name's Matt Thomas and I'm one of the founders of iCAAD, and it's my privilege to be here to introduce Chip Summers, who I knew by reputation for about 10 years before I actually met him in person. And when we were offered the opportunity to have Chip speak at iCAAD, it was just like I was kind of blown away, and my reaction was, really, do you think he will? Thank goodness, actually he did, and here he is, and it's a real privilege to be able to introduce him and to come and talk about such an important topic. I'm not even going to go there in terms of what the topic is, other than is probably, in my opinion, the most important topic of our generation. And I will leave it at that and say no more and introduce Mr. Chip Summers. Thank you very much.
There's some seats over there. I'll just finish my job as an usherette and then I will get started. Anybody who knows me know that before I ever do a talk like this, I would always apologize to anybody I've spoken to this morning because I may have given you the impression that I was talking to you, but I actually wasn't. I have no idea what you said to me. I may have nodded appropriately, but I didn't listen to a word you were saying. You may have consoled me on the recent loss of my mother, and I probably would have said, it's great, isn't it? Which it actually was, but that's another story for me and my therapist. So I have waited. There's a spare seat over there in the middle there. I have waited 34 years, I think, to be asked to speak at one of these conferences, and I got the email through to say, would you come and speak? And I was, of course, suitably excited. Seats in the middle. I told my wife, I ran upstairs and said, I've been asked to speak at iCAAD, and being the kind of logistics nut that she is, she immediately got on the computer. And the first thing she said was, who's Raquel Lerner? And I said, oh, she's a big noise. She goes to all these conferences and she's a great draw. And she said, well, she's speaking at the same time you are. So that was a bit of a bummer. I am very aware that there have been a lot of presentations here of a very high level of intellectual, deep, educational studies that have been done. I am a simple journeyman, and I have kept my approach to the topic simple throughout my career. I'm an old school addict as well. I'm in recovery, so I need to kind of declare that. I'm an old school addict. When I say I'm an old school addict, I mean I was an addict before mobile phones. This is a defining moment in the history of addiction. Once mobile phones were invented, the whole gravity of being an addict was taken out of the game completely. My very first script, I go back that far, that my very first script was an amp of diamorphine. Bloody good it was too, but it was that's what used to get prescribed, and I'm old enough to have been dealt with by some of the most famous bent doctors in the world, people like Anne Daly, Dr. Petro, who never had a premises, but you could find him up and down the in between Queensway and Bayswater, and he would literally write out a script for you in the street as long as you crossed his palm with 40 pounds. It was an era when there were a lot of bent doctors around, and I don't suppose that's changed too much. For the economists amongst you who wish to know how successful the government strategy on stopping importing of heroin, when I William, there's a stool over there if you want. When I was using the last time I used 1984, heroin was £90 a gram. So technically it should be about 600, and I believe it to be something around 65, 70 quid now. So there's an awful lot of heroin around. I was put on methadone quite early. I was one of the first people to be titrated by Dr. Dasgupta at the famous DDU at St Mary's Hospital. The titration process was that you had a hit, well, you pretended that you hadn't had a hit, but you had a hit, and then he locked you in a room and observed you for 24 hours to see how bad you got. And obviously, as anybody who deals with addicts knows, that within 3 hours of having their last injection, most addicts are as close to death as it's possible to get. And so you did a fine performance, and the better your performance, the bigger your script. And I ended up in various places. I went to the first Phoenix place that was down in South London. And I also, what am I talking about today? Rehab, dead or alive, yeah. I ended up at a place called Narconon, which was cleverly, there is one seat over there, Barbara, I think. Cleverly called Narconon, which I discovered was run by Scientologists, which I stayed at for a year or so, and they were nuts, yeah. I will tend to generalize. I'm going to use the words addict and alcoholic. I can't be bothered to use the longer variations on those. But, so, who am I? I am a liar and a charlatan, a confidence trickster, etc., etc. Please read it at your leisure. I can assure you that that is the kindest part of the article that was written about me. Why am I telling you this? Because I think it is indicative of what I'm hoping to demonstrate during the course of today. But what I'd had the temerity to do was to go onto a television program and about legalizing cannabis. And I had suggested that perhaps before we made that bold step, it might be an idea that we actually did some clinical trials first before we claimed that it cured cancer and did things like that, that perhaps we should have some proper clinical trials. And I also, which is one of my big things, is that I questioned who was actually going to manufacture this cannabis, because the only people who were going to be really in the frame to do so were the alcohol industry, the tobacco industry, and the pharmaceutical industry, three industries which have covered themselves in moral glory over the years, and I felt that that might be a problem too. And that was the response I got. Shortly afterwards, I don't know whether you can see this, but this came out in an economy magazine. Basically what it's talking about is an investment opportunity for CBD. And they reckon that there's going to be a 55 billion market projected by 2023. So what's really good news is that all those wicked drug dealers have had their immoral earnings taken off them, and they are now, the money that will be made from drugs is now back where it belongs, in the hand of bankers. And I was, then that was a recent article about the pharmaceutical industry and the whole kind of online way in which you can just go online, pretend you've got an illness, they pretend that they've given you a medical assessment, and they send you opiates through the post. So I'm illustrating those points because, as I say, I'm an old school worker. I was fortunate enough with a couple of other people in this room to be really involved in early NA when rehabs hadn't really been, only just beginning to be kind of thought of, and it was very difficult. And a few people, you know, you could get the whole of the NA fellowship in one room. It was that long ago. And it was very difficult to get detox. I was very lucky. I got into a place called Clouds, which had just opened. I think I realised now that I was the second addict to ever go there. I thought they were incredibly experienced and knew exactly how to detox somebody who was taking 50 milligrams of Valium, 75 millilitres of methadone, as much heroin as he could get his hand on, and several special brews. And when they detoxed me on Habanevrin, I thought, they know what they're doing. This seems good. It is extraordinary how alcoholics always seem to only have a couple of glasses of wine in the evening, and addicts have this peculiar perverse pleasure in outdoing each other. So you kind of get a sort of Monty Python sketch in a group therapy when the first person says, oh, I had a gram a day habit, and the next one says, oh God, a gram or 2 grams, and then by the time you've got around the group, the last person is jacking up 4 grams of heroin behind his eyeball before breakfast, because it's important to outdo each other. I think it was Kipling who said, once a junkie, always a junkie. And my medical notes would bear that out. My medical notes, which I have had access to, told me that I was absolutely useless and beyond hope, that there was no point in treating me because I was too far gone. And that phrase repeats itself several times throughout my medical notes. I have also been diagnosed as a psychopath, and I was recommended to go to the Henderson Unit for Psychopaths or the Salvation Army. They did actually call me a charming psychopath, which I took to be wonderful until I discovered that it was the same diagnosis they gave Ted Bundy, which did tend to take something of the edge off it. But today is about history, in a way, of the 30 Years' War. Alas, not that one, because I did actually do that at A-level. It's this one. So, the reason I gave you that little bit of background stuff is because abstinence is only, in this country, about 40 years old at the absolute maximum. It is a moderately new phenomena. And certainly in the early 80s, when abstinence first came along, it was considered to be a bit strange. Group therapy, detox, going to meetings, and it was quite a change from the early treatment that alcoholics particularly had been given. That is an alcoholic ward from America somewhere, where they used to just strap you to the bed and you went through your DTs, and it's not surprising that it was considered a moderately hopeless way of treating people, because I don't suppose many people got better from just being strapped to a bed and going through DTs and then sent home. So I'm not surprised that it was considered hopeless, and places like Broadway Lodge, Farm Place began to creep up, but they were predominantly for people with money, and I was fortunate enough to be able to walk into my rehab just on the basis of phoning them up for 2 weeks, which is nowadays, of course, would be absolutely, you wouldn't get that at all. There were DDUs. That was the only picture I could get of St Mary's Hospital. I do admit that it is somewhat out of date. But when I was just about to get clean, there was lots of, London was awash with heroin. The Shah of Persia had declined, and everybody had taken all their money out of Persia then with heroin, and Vietnam was bringing in lots of heroin. So the place was, we had a big problem. And along comes this new therapy called abstinence. But there was a problem. The problem was it came from here. It came from, well, I gather now that there's somewhere there, but it came from where is it? There, Minnesota. And for English people, this was a big problem. You have no idea what a big problem this was. It's American. It cannot possibly be any good. And people took an immediate dislike to the Minnesota model because they just couldn't understand how anything coming out of America could be any good. But people did start to get better. And the whole kind of field began to expand. And that is when war broke out. So what we had at that time were a lot of GPs who had absolutely no understanding of addiction at all. They had very few, there were some bent doctors. There were people like Griffith Edwards, John Strang, who were doing some studying, really more. It was more of a study of addiction down at the Maudsley. But it was very much, very limited, and very few GPs knew how to deal with addicts, except perhaps to give them a script as quickly as possible to get them out of the surgery. That's pretty much all that happened. And then suddenly, on the back of this Minnesota model, you've got these kind of amateurs who were coming along and working, doing something, breaking the stereotype. They were supposed to just be useless people who could never get better, and suddenly they were actually working. And some of them were even educating themselves, which was just a big shock to the system, because these people were supposed to be incurable and of no use at all. So I can imagine that to the medical profession, this kind of whole process was quite threatening. I can't remember the exact date, but at some point, I would think round about 1989, round about that, one of the few big studies about different modalities was done in America called Project Match. It was about one of the few large studies that have compared different modalities. And I think, if my memory serves me right, they judged 12-step rehab with AA, they judged 12 sessions of motivational interviewing, they did a day program, they did 5, and I can't remember what the other one was, but they did 5 different modalities. And the result of the study, and it was quite a substantial study, many tens of thousands took part in it. The result of the study was that there wasn't really much difference what you did. The results were pretty much the same. Not great, quite low percentage, but they were pretty much the same. Except rehab and AA came out just a tiny, tiny bit better than all the others. And boy, did we make everybody know it. We made sure they really knew that we were the better and best way of dealing with addiction. We also, in the Minnesota model, called it a disease, which was incredibly controversial in England. That did not go down at all well. Even if you told people that the World Health Organization had classified it as a disease, that word created a lot of tension and animosity. It is a classified disease. It is in DSM-4. What are we on? DSM-5 now, in ICD-9, ICD-10. But then so is masturbatory shoe fetish, which, for those of you that wish to know, is ICD-10 F65.0. And there is a picture for those of you that are particularly afflicted. I thought I would give you a little thrill. Nowadays, we're finding out a lot more. We know a lot more. There's a lot less guesswork, which has pretty much dominated the psychiatric profession for many years, up until quite recently, a lot of guesswork. But now we're beginning to find out with MRI scans, we can actually see how the brain works, we can do a lot of genetic breakdowns, and we can find out much, much more knowledge than we ever used to in the past. But this whole thing has created a massive split in the field, which has remained. And it's that I want to talk about. There is a that is my split in the field slide. A little word of warning that when you put into Google Images a crack, It's wise to perhaps be a little bit more specific because I can assure you my eyelids and brain have seen more than I needed to see in order to get that image for you. So because it's FA Cup season, I thought we would look at the strengths and weaknesses of both teams. So I'm going to start, as I said, both teams do have strengths and weaknesses, and I'm not sure we always acknowledge them, but I'm going to do it for you. So I'm going to start with harm reduction strengths. Well, they're geographically broad. Most people can have access to some kind of drug or alcohol service. Most towns have some sort of place where somebody can go and get a script or technically some advice or something. They can probably find somebody somewhere. People don't therefore need to be alone. It's a very isolating condition. But because there is a service fairly locally, people don't necessarily need to be completely alone. And obviously it's somewhere where health checks can be done. The very purpose of the whole kind of harm reduction field is to reduce harm. I think predominantly there was a time when that harm was questionably whether it was there to protect society rather than the individual, especially at the time of the HIV epidemic, which is actually still with us. But I think there is certainly an opportunity to do good health checks and give you harm-reducing information. It's a good place to get signposted to your GP, perhaps chiropodist, mental health clinic, anything else. It's probably, if it's a good service, a place where you can get signposted to somewhere quite appropriate. It's obviously where you're going to get substitute prescribing. Substitute prescribing works really well with opiates, obviously, because you can give people a substitute. I have seen substitute prescribing for amphetamines. Anybody who's ever taken amphetamines, looking around the room, I can see some ravaged faces. I know there are a few. All you have to do is stop taking amphetamines, have a sleep, have something to eat, and you're all right, really. It's not a difficult treatment modality. It's quite simple. But I have seen people given substitute prescribing for amphetamine for 5, 6, 7 years. That sort of thing can happen. Obviously, with the introduction of what I showed earlier on, of the increase, although the use of heroin perhaps might be on the decline, the use of codeine opiate-based medication is without doubt definitely on the increase. Opiates bought online, over-the-counter medication becoming a massive problem. Loads of people presenting to treatment taking 60 to 80 Nurofen plus a day. You know, there are a lot of people who are still in need of opiate substitutes. How substitute prescribing works with some of the newer drugs like ketamine, methadone, all the new drugs that are coming on, are going to be coming on, I have no idea. I just don't really see how they are going to be able to do that. And what I do think I see is a lack of trying to learn and acquire knowledge about how all these different drugs actually impact on people. But in principle, it's a place where you can get substitute prescribing. Completely non-judgmental paraphernalia. You can walk out with as many syringes and needles as you like, which for an old-timer like me is quite beyond belief. It's the fact that needles can now become a litter problem is just beyond comprehension, because one would never ever throw away a needle until rust began to appear, at which point you might throw it away. But the idea that paraphernalia can become a litter problem because it's so easy to get hold of is extraordinary. But you can get them as many as you like. In a good service, one would hope that there would be some support groups, maybe some groups about how to deal with an overdose, maybe some groups about managing life, finance. There might be in a good service. There should potentially be some kind of other support services. There's absolutely no pressure on any clients attending to make any change whatsoever. No pressure. You can do exactly what you want. You can remain exactly as you wish, and you can just stay like that for the rest of your life if you want to. And actually, probably in some cases, they're quite happy for you to do so. I put DTTOs there because I've been hearing over the last day about drug courts in America, which are just, and this is about as close for the drug treatment orders, about as close as we got to anything resembling a drug court in this country, where people were given the choice of either going to prison or going for 40 hours of rehabilitation. And as a result, quite a lot of people who had never thought of going to rehab were put into rehab and were given the kind of choices that you get given in an American drug court. And I thought that was a really good thing, because we all know that nobody comes in brimming with motivation, or at least I am always extremely skeptical of somebody who comes in brimming with motivation. I like people to come in with a degree of anxiety, because I think that's an appropriate response to having to make a substantial change after 20 years of a certain behaviour. But unfortunately, with drug treatment orders, when they were introduced, I think something the Daily Mail got hold of it, finding out that 76% of people failed their 40-hour allotted drug treatment order. And as a result, the government scrapped them. Failing to mention that 79% of people fail their driving test the first time, but we don't tell you that you can't have another go at it. You can have as many goes as you like. So there were times in 1995, drug strategy started to talk about abstinence, started to talk about recovery in a positive way, and a lot of us in the field started to get quite optimistic. Fools. So let's have a look at the weaknesses of harm reduction. Well, one of the things that anybody who works in a drug service will say is that trouble with abstinence is that you all die. Anybody who relapses dies, and your success rate is shit. And that's, you'll hear that a lot about AA, abstinence-based rehab, that comes from a lot of drug services. They will tell you that, what's the point, your success rates are really poor, and when you relapse after a period of abstinence, you will die. Well, I think the success rate that they have been able to get hold of is, for harm reduction, is 3.6% of people getting clean through a methadone program. And people are still dying. The opiate methadone death rate is on the increase. People are still chaotic. People are on methadone. I question, I mean, I know I'm a bit of a sort of purist. I do question how normal being on methadone is. If I'm taking a substance that if I don't take in the morning, I will go into withdrawal, I think I question whether that's normal. I question whether I am so tied to where I need to pick up my script, whether that makes me normal. But I am a bit of a sort of a bit of a purist. And I question about, you know, you're not allowed to drive, you're definitely not allowed to drive while on methadone, so your job opportunities are quite limited. There are lots of things that you can't do on methadone, but you're not supposed to drive on methadone. Okay. There are a lot of positive urines being produced. Urine samples are taken on a regular basis, and a lot of them produce information that says that the person is not just taking methadone, they are taking other substances as well. which you have to then question, why are you prescribing methadone? If you are prescribing methadone to bring stability and normality to this person's life, and they are still producing urines that say they're taking opiates, why are you continuing to give them methadone? Because what you're actually doing is doing what I was doing, was just getting free drugs, which just topped up what I was already doing. One thing that a lot of people in the harm reduction have is complete contempt for AA and abstinence before they've even gone to a meeting. There was a lot of contempt prior to investigation, and when you actually ask people if they've been to a meeting, they will usually not be able to tell you anything about a meeting at all. I have a problem with the fact that you have a golden opportunity when you are distributing paraphernalia to give a bit of hope to somebody. There's plenty of space on the back of a syringe packet to write something about getting clean, about where you could perhaps stop doing it. A story of somebody who had been using methadone but had gone to rehab and got clean. There's plenty of opportunities to give a positive message of hope, but it's not given. Your staff are incredibly overworked. It's not unusual for people to have 40 clients on their caseload. And if you've got a 37.5-hour week, early morning meetings, going out and seeing people, you are not going to be able to see your clients once a week for any length of time at all. And most clients are lucky to see their drug worker once a fortnight, maybe 10 minutes. You're doing okay? And it's quite easy to, I used to find it very easy to say that something sad had happened, and I would get my script increased as a result of that. So that the person was actually prescribing methadone for sadness, but actually I find that really rather odd. And also, the most chaotic clients are often the ones who get suspended. They don't make their appointments. They are late. I would put forward the contention the most chaotic clients are probably the ones who need your services more than anybody else, because they're not able to be stable enough to be there. They're the ones that should not be suspended. And if they use, they get suspended. What do they do then? They go back to using again. There are 2 pages of weaknesses for both sides, don't worry. Nice and fair. NDTMS. I have one here from a big organisation. When the NDTMS first started, it was 15 fields, I think. This one from a big organisation is 37 pages long. It's now become a job of work filling in an NDTMS form. It used to be something you could do quite quickly. It's now become, you need somebody to do the NDTMS forms. National Treatment Data Monitoring System. And it gets lots of useful information like, are you sex working to fund your substance use? Yes or no? They don't have hobby down there, but I don't know why, but they have nothing about childhood sexual abuse, although it's 1 in 4. And it gives here as an option alternative treatments should everything else fail. For clients, there's guided self-help, MET, education and awareness, access to workshops, motivational work, one-to-one support, access to group work, 12 counselling sessions, medical assessment, community detox. Nothing at all about AA, NA or rehab or abstinence as an alternative should your methadone be failing. And this form is very, very easy to fudge. This form is those for services that are on contracts and have to meet certain criteria and numbers, and you can fudge this system really easily. You have to put forward that you've had a successful discharge, and in order to complete this and meet the terms of your contract. That is very easily done because you just make a phone call to your local somebody else and you say, I'm referring somebody to you, and they go, okay, all right, and you put the phone down and you tick the box saying successful discharge. And that gives you a good statistic to take home with you. It's a huge document. If ever you've seen it, it's then followed up with a thing called a TOPS form, which is a treatment outcome profile, which, if you've ever read the wording of it, is geared very, very much around welfare people, people who are on welfare, people who have criminal histories. It's got a very, that kind of tone to it. So the percentage of clients who are getting detox, who are currently on methadone, the number who are actually getting detox and rehab is currently at 2%. 2% of people on the 250,000 people who are on methadone or substitute prescribing, only 2% are getting places in rehab. Things like, if ever any of you have ever gone to visit a statutory service, you will notice that there's an intercom system, there are locked doors, you probably have to talk to somebody through triple glass, and that sort of stuff has an effect on clients. Clients don't not notice that stuff. They know when you make them feel unwanted and you are fearful of them, and you don't bother to put any decent furniture and the place looks like shit. Clients notice that stuff. And what they really need is, when I ran a rehab in a local town, we had our front door was open all the time. You could walk in it whenever you wanted to. There was no intercom, and we never had any problem at all. I think locks and that kind of very almost humiliating way of having to engage with somebody just has no beneficial effect at all. You have little to no interaction with the family. You won't even let them know that they're there, obviously because of confidentiality, but there's a whole 4 or 5 people behind every client who really are very distressed, who really need help, don't get any help at all. 1 in 4 have childhood sexual abuse issues, and I hope that this latest issue of DDN highlights the importance of that fact for the clients that we are dealing with. The number of people with childhood sexual abuse who turn to drug dependency is very high, and therefore is something that should really be dealt with. Sometimes the inexperience of your staff really, really shows. I mean, there are people who are on methadone, who are recovery workers. I'm sure they try very hard to do their best job, but they're on methadone, they're on a script, and sometimes the inexperience of the staff really does show through. One thing that really makes me passionately angry is the number of times I hear people say, there's no point in dealing with him, he's been using too long. He's over 50, he won't make it. Lots of times people are judged as being not really worth the effort. And I find that abhorrent. How dare you, as a worker, how dare you judge somebody else's ability to get better? It's disgusting, but it happens a lot. I don't know how many hours of time have been wasted by various people working in the field about whether we should call people addicts or problem drug users, and I think that became unacceptable, and then I think it was problem drug misusers, and then about 4 months of meetings later it became substance abuse, I don't know. But we've wasted a lot of time trying to find terminology that I've never in 34 years heard a client use. I've never had a client sit down in front of me and say, I am a problem substance alcohol misuser and I'm looking for help. They say I'm an addict, or I might be an alcoholic. I don't want to be one, but I might be. That's what they say to me. But we've wasted so much time in endless meetings. Oh dear God. the National Treatment Agency. It was going to revolutionise everything, bring all the field together, and everybody was going to work closely together, and it was going to be revolutionary. Except the man in charge didn't like abstinence at all. It didn't help. It's the staff cost of the NTA for 1 year. Just the staff costs. 1 year. Cost of the board of the NTA was over £500,000 a year, with a very nice pension, thank you very much. What did they come up with? I think we probably spent 18 months talking about payment by results. Nobody had a fucking clue what a result was. We had no idea whatsoever. I spent one conference and somebody came up with the idea that maybe we could make a result 3 years without reoffending. And I thought, hold on, I've got to wait 3 years to get paid before it doesn't feel good. And we wasted weeks and months and a year and a half of time talking about this nonsense. One day I was sitting at home, and I think it was Tony Blair. It was somebody I didn't like anyway, but I think it was him. And he suddenly said to me, he said, "We've had 36,000 people in treatment this year," and I literally spat my coffee out. I thought this is. I didn't even know that there were that many rehab beds in the country. I didn't even realise that was possible. Fantastic. Until I realised, you've gone and stolen the terminology. Treatment doesn't mean, we all knew in the old days, if you were in treatment, you were in somewhere like Clouds or Broadway Lodge or somewhere like that. Not any longer. It means you're on methadone. If you're in recovery any longer, we all knew what that meant. It meant you were clean. It doesn't any longer. You've stolen the words to suit your bloody statistics. So you can stand up and say, we've got 36,000 people in recovery. Bullshit. You've got 36,000 people on methadone that year. Big deal. Okay, it's our turn. Right.
In the UK, is it against the law to drive on
Yes, it is.
in the UK?
Yep.
Yeah, because in the United States,
You can't. In this form here, right here, I understand that I need to inform the DVLA if I'm on methadone. If you inform the DVLA you're on methadone, you're going to be waiting a year to get your license back.
the United States doesn't have it for
No,
10 years.
I'm afraid it doesn't happen here. Not allowed to. So, let's have a look at the other team. Now that we're in FA Cup time. Right, let's have a look at ourselves. I think ourselves. Maybe I haven't seen that many people from the harm reduction field here today, or yesterday, or tomorrow. Okay, let's have a look at ourselves. We are the only way to get better. There is no other way. Absolutely no other way to get better except through rehab and AA. There's no other way. Have you got any idea how annoying that is to doctors and workers and people who've kept somebody alive for 10 years on a methadone script? How annoying it is for some prat to come along and say, the only way people are going to get better is if you go to rehab and go to AA. You completely have negated all their hard work, and it pisses people off. In the oldie days, most of the funding for a lot of rehabs was done through insurance funding. It wasn't unknown for rehabs to have somebody back 5 times. Oh God, I wasn't that emotional. Wasn't unknown for people to have people back 5 times. You'd think after the 3rd time they might have said, maybe this isn't the place for them. But no, they came with money, so they were allowed to come back 5, 6, 7 times. So clients started to take on a financial commodity They started to become a financial commodity. As a result, people became very myopic about relapse. Somebody's in a treatment program, has got insurance, has had a little relapse, and I've seen this, so I know this. Had a little relapse. Well, it wasn't that bad. He only went out for one night. No, let's not discharge him. Let's keep him. If he wasn't on insurance, the attitude might be a little bit different. But if he had regular money coming in, let's keep him in. It wasn't that bad. I've worked in hospitals. I've worked in places where the admission criteria is fudged. You're dealing with somebody who is a chronic alcoholic, but you can't get funding for alcoholism because his insurance won't do it. Right down to, I've heard consultants say, right down to depression, anxiety. Well, I've no doubt they were depressed, but that wasn't what they came to treatment for. But that was how they got the funding. They were lying. Certainly in the old days, people who'd been discharged from treatment would be marched to the front door, and one of the therapists would say, "You're going to die. You're so self-willed and stubborn. You're going to die." Well, technically they're correct, of course, but I don't think that's what they meant. They thought, you're going to die probably the next 3 weeks, because you are so stubborn. Now the reason I make this point is because these people go back home. They go back to their drug service. And when they report what happened in the rehab, and the person says, what was it like? They said, I'm going to die if I don't, because I'm so stubborn. Those people are going to think, those people in that rehab are mad. What are they talking about? That's just stupid. That's just crazy. But clients go home and report back on what's happened to them in rehab. And what they can hear is sometimes really peculiar. This is my favourite. Okay? I do admit, I have to say, this is my favourite. No relationships for the first year. Because, I don't know why. I have no idea which team of sadistic therapeutic counsellors bored one morning said, how can we make our clients' lives more miserable than it is already? Let's tell them they can't have relationships. Let's have a mixed gender unit where we expect people to be highly emotional and vulnerable. We expect people to be honest and open with their feelings. But my God, if you own up to having some feelings for another member of the community, you will be discharged. It's just, and that client goes back to his drug service. What happened? Well, I told them that I quite fancied somebody else in the group. And they're looking at you like you're crazy. I have to admit I had a relationship in treatment. And Peter McCann nearly caught us in the chapel. Fortunately, we were on our knees, which made life easier. I understand why we have this stuff about no relationships, because we are vulnerable in our first year. But why do we single out relationships? People's parents die in the first year. People lose jobs in the first year. Life's bloody hard. Why single out this? And what happens on day 366? Yeah. Well, I'm suddenly imbued with the ability to deal with relationships. I had a breakup when I was 7 years clean. It almost mullered me. It's nonsense. It's just, I just don't get it. It's something that has always really, as you can tell, really irritated me, because it's just doesn't make any sense. That always irritates me as well. How are you? Fine. Oh, if you feel insecure and nervous, no, I'm fine. God, Jesus, give me a break. Talking of which, God features a lot. I don't in my lifetime think that the language will change. It surprises me, because I've run rehabs or worked in rehabs for years. I would think at least 86% of the people who come in, I can't stand meetings. What's wrong with meetings? I said, oh, bloody God. We all know that. We all know that one of the main things that puts people off going to meetings is that word. But we wouldn't ever consider changing it. Couldn't consider changing it for a support group or anything like that. It's got to be God. For an atheist like myself, I have found it offensive to spend 34 years having to constantly change that bloody word. And it gives credibility to the fact that people think that we are a religious bunch of people. There are people who are still alive today who used to really get off on being abusive. People who worked in rehabs who were very, very abusive. You have very vulnerable people in your care, and it's very easy to start playing Charlie Big Potatoes in group. And there are lots of people who really enjoy it, who thrive on the reputation for being a hard man or woman. And it's that kind of, we'll break you down to build you up. My experience of those places is they do a lot of breaking down, they do very little building up. If there's one thing that addicts don't need any help with at all, it's beating themselves up. They know how to do that inside out and backwards. What they need is love and care and compassion. They don't need beating up about that. They know how to do that every way you want. Especially within the fellowships, the attitude to relapse is really draconian. You could have 4, 5, 6 years recovery, have one night out. Oh, sorry, back to the start. Back you go. All that 4 or 5 years gone. No, back to the start, white keyring, or whatever it is in AA. I don't know what it is in AA. All that progress, all that stuff you've learnt in that time is rubbished. No, back to the start. And as a result, it's really, really difficult for people to come back if they have a relapse, because the place is not welcoming. People are frightened of you. People are, for some reason, scared of you. I do understand about early anonymity, especially I know it was really important in the early days of AA that anonymity was important, because Bill W. and the others didn't want everybody going off talking about AA and being drunk, and it was important. But certainly I know nowadays we all understand that, relapse happens, we accept AA, it's an established part of life all over the world. We understand that people relapse. It's not so dramatic as it was in the very, very early days of AA. My experience is that when people do come out, it really makes the recovery referral rates go through the roof. And I mean, obviously there are some people who would wish to retain their anonymity, but I wish we would be more, keep it less of a secret. That when I went to see my doctor the other day, and this is not the start of a joke, I went to see my doctor the other day, and she said, "Do you mind if I got these 3 medical students with me?" And oh God, it was a bowel problem, so I was delighted that we were going to have an audience of 4 people. And I said, started talking, and anyway, got around. She said, "What do you do?" And I told her, and that none of them knew a single thing about addiction. Not one of them. They went, "Oh my God, that's amazing! Whoa, God!" I mean, I loved it, but I mean, they knew nothing, because nobody. If you get well, go to your doctors, go to your probation officers, tell people. Don't keep it a bloody secret. That is an accusation that I think is rubbish. It's, oh, there's all these predatory males at AA or NA. Oh my God, it's nothing but predatory people. Unlike the pub on a Friday night, of course, where nobody's predatory at all. Everybody's extremely well behaved on a Friday night. So, judgmental about relapses I've already talked about because I got out of order. But, I think we're pretty harsh on people who relapse, and I think in lots of cases we miss an opportunity. Somebody who has a tiny little slip, relapse, that's a learning opportunity. That's a real good opportunity for somebody to change their behaviour, learn from what they've done, and make changes to their life. If you just discharge them because it's broken your goal, you miss that opportunity to give them that education. And I think obviously there are times, there's relapse and relapse, but I think we should be much more open-minded about certain opportunities to give people a learning experience that we actually at the moment miss. Individualised plans, I've been around everywhere today, and I've seen lots of brochures about individualised plans, but the problem is, I think when it actually comes down to it, when you've got somebody in rehab for 5 weeks, the real individual plan doesn't really happen quite as individually as you'd like, because you've got a program to get through, and you've got to get them through a certain lot of things, and they've all got to attend this lecture, and they've all got to attend that lecture. I'm not sure they're quite as individual as you'd like. This didn't actually cover us in glory very much, referral fees. I noticed that the people who used to charge referral fees never rang up a statutory service and said, you've just referred somebody to us. Could you please give us 15% extra every week? Because the referral service would have said, fuck off. Of course you're not going to get 15% extra a week. But a lot of private people paid every week, 15, 20%. If you can afford to give somebody else 15 to 20% every week just for the privilege of having that person in your rehab, maybe you were charging too much in the first place. I think that's one of the things that has made the whole field really discredited. CQC, I'm a great fan of CQC. I am actually a great fan of CQC. I think it's brought a stability to the market that we needed. I have noticed that a lot of places started cropping up abroad once CQC really got into their stride. Whether that is coincidental, I have no idea. But I am certainly aware that I think it's something that we should all be striving to do. So let's look at our strengths. CQC is the Care Quality Commission. Sorry, it's an agency that establishes whether you're any good or not. So our strengths are obviously that rehab is a really safe place. There's no work, there's no dealers, there's no pestering partners, there's no children, there's nothing you can just concentrate on getting yourself well, and that is a peaceful place to be, and that's a really good and lovely thing. It doesn't collude with the problem, as I believe harm reduction does. It doesn't really collude with the problem. It makes you face the problem head on, gives you a real big reality check, and that, I believe, with this particular condition, is absolutely vital, that you have a real reality check about what you're doing and what your problem is and why you're there. The family get included, past issues get included, aftercare gets included. All these things are absolutely vital. The whole holistic kind of approach to the person, the client, gets dealt with, and that obviously gives the person a much better opportunity if they're returning to a family that's been educated in what to expect and how to deal with it. That's much better for the client to go back to somewhere where they know they're going to be. Sorry, every time I drink water it makes me really upset. That's got to be much better for the client. Success rate. It's not brilliant. It's certainly not brilliant. It's pretty low. I've seen people claim success rate of 80%. Just makes us look stupid. Everybody knows that's not possible. But I've seen it in magazines, 80% clients are successful. I think most of us would be lucky, really lucky, if we were working at 20% sustained recovery. That would be incredible. Well, abstinence, retained abstinence.
Over what period of time?
Well, I'm saying, I would say about a year, 2 years. I mean, I don't know what a success rate is, really. Yeah. But I think to claim success rates of 80% just make us look stupid. People are taken out of the system altogether. They go from being a cost to the society, they start being an input into society. So that, obviously, that's really good for them and really good for us. They're much more unlikely to reoffend when successful. They're much more unlikely to reoffend. And even if they only get through detox, which is often, obviously, when most people leave treatment, just after detox, they're 3 days after detox, they're feeling a bit better. That's when a lot of people leave treatment. But even then, they've had a chance to experience abstinence. They've done something they didn't think they could ever do before. And that in itself is a really good thing to have done. Being part of a community lowers the shame and isolation of being an addict, being an alcoholic, being amongst people who are similar. It really reduces the shame and isolation that is incredibly strong within the addict community. AA and NA, completely free, even more geographically available than the rehab services. Anywhere in the world you can go to a meeting. It's completely free. You can go anywhere and there's a meeting somewhere. And as I say, you can come and go as you please. You don't have to sit around if you don't want to. You can get up and walk out, unlike here apparently, but you can get up and go as you want. I think one of the things about AA that's often misunderstood is how great a practice ground it is for social skills. That ability to be amongst other people and kind of be in an uncomfortable position but be safe enough to be able to say it and talk about it. I think it's a kind of really part of the whole fellowship process that often gets is minimized. But I think it's a fantastic opportunity for people to really have a safe practice ground for learning how to live life anew. It inspires people and provides hope, which is lacking in a lot of other places. We need hope. We need people to inspire us and to make us better and to make us feel that we can actually achieve it. Fills up a lot of time as well, going to meetings. When you get clean, you suddenly get 7 hours of your life back every day. Haven't got a clue what to do with it. And going to meetings is a great way of filling in that time in a safe place. I've given my version of the pluses and minuses of both sides. I believe that when both sides come together, there is a real potential for it to work incredibly well. I think in the next few years, obviously, the continued knowledge that we gain from genetic behavior, brain behavior, is going to give us far more real information about how the brain of, say, an addictive personality actually works, rather than the guesswork that has been going on for many years. We're going to have so much more knowledge. What we're going to do with that knowledge, I don't quite know. I mean, if we get to the point where we can define a genetic failing that shows alcohol dependency in a baby, I suppose we could make sure they don't ever get anywhere near alcohol in their lives, but I mean, I don't quite know what we're going to do, but I'm sure we're going to have much, much more genetic information that's going to be really helpful to us. I would really hope that more people come out. I don't think personally I would like to see many, many more people come out. Certainly when celebrities come out, sometimes it goes wrong, but a lot of the time, certainly our referral rates used to go through the roof. Used to really spike every time a celebrity came out and said he was in recovery, because for sometimes people it was the first time they'd ever heard that recovery was possible. And I hope that more and more people will do that. I do know of services where they work together, where there's NA meetings, NA staff working in a methadone program, and they're working together and they have fantastic results. They're not disrespecting each other, they're acknowledging each other's part, and they're working together. And there are examples, few, but there are examples of the services working together and producing fantastic results. I used to use this, have it above my desk at work.
Could you read it out?
If you treat an individual as he is, he will remain how he is. If you treat him as if he were what he ought to be and could be, he will become what he ought to be and could be.
Sorry, I'm leaving. I salute you.
Thank you. That's the person that I got into this field to work with. I got into this field for one reason, to help people like her. Actually, three reasons. It's turning into a Monty Python sketch. Probably the only job I could do with my record. I wanted work. I wanted money. I wanted to be paid. I wanted to help people like her. And her. And him. And them. I wanted to be able to turn this homeless man, who had been homeless for 2 years, who was so shaky that he could not even hold a glass to swallow his detox pills, to become him. I love this work. Surely it is not beyond our ability to work together, to solve problems together and to bring hope and life. We deal with the same people. We should be working together, putting our differences aside and trying to get people better. Thank you very much.
We've got a little bit of time left to take some questions.
Oh God. Okay. Does anybody have? Yes.
Yeah, just a disclaimer, I'm in abstinence-based recovery myself, and I'm very happy with it.
Yeah.
One of the things that maybe you could clarify as well for me about the methadone treatment, and when I was put onto Subutex and methadone many years ago, was it wasn't just about me, it was acknowledging that my habit affected the community around me. So there was also an element of crime reduction, and there were one-man crime waves as well that were being stopped by just giving them methadone so they're not ill, like acknowledging the disease. This person's going to wake up ill and commit crime to fund their habit. Is that a part of methadone treatment? Is that acknowledged, that it's not just about the addict, it is about protecting communities?
Well, I think that's the, I mean, I think the one of the primary purposes of harm reduction was to protect society from the spread of HIV particularly, and obviously prolific offenders. The idea was to stabilise them. I question whether it actually brings stability, and I question whether that person is actually stable on methadone, because they do need to have it every single day, otherwise they're going to be in chronic withdrawal. So I sort of do question the normality of that. I mean, I understand the theory, But I think in practice, very, very few people, although I would be shouted down probably quite loudly, I think very few people actually just stick to their methadone script without topping up with other things. Because it doesn't quite do the trick, thank you. An addict wants to get stoned. It's like giving an alcoholic a quarter of a bottle of vodka. I don't want to be a little bit stoned, I want to be smashed. So they're never going to give you 150 mils of methadone because they know that, you know, you're going to sell it and do whatever you like with it. So you're always going to be given just enough to stabilise you, which means that you're probably, more than likely, going to be using on top. But I think obviously the raison d'etre was to try to bring stability to a very chaotic group of people. Yeah. Yes?
This may not be relevant to you, but the major problem at the moment is addiction to prescription drugs.
Yeah.
Do they fit? I mean, I've spoken to people who have a problem there,
Yeah.
and they say they feel, you know, they're teachers or professional people, and they feel very uncomfortable going into a place full of people who are, you know, street drug users and so on, all the rest of it. In fact, there was one who gave a story about he was a teacher and some of his pupils were there, and they said, "Oh, didn't know you were doing this."
Yeah.
You know. Is that? They seem to be just left. Is that any part of?
I think there's two things there. I think one is that yes, a rehab, a harm reduction unit usually looks like shit, and isn't a kind of welcoming place where there's, you know, a nice place where people it gives off the vibe of being just a sort of junky hellhole. You know, I mean, that's a slight exaggeration, but it's not a sort of welcoming place for somebody who's a professional. But that is definitely a massively growing problem. The doctors, if they are presented with that problem, will obviously refer you to your local drug service. And I completely understand how, I mean, obviously in time you would obviously try and get the person to accept that they have their own, they're just as addicted as the scuffy little addict that's sitting next to them. But it's definitely becoming a huge problem. And you know, they're sort of beginning to put a few things in place to make it more difficult. But what you can get online now, I mean, I have a friend. Oh, it's nice to know that. No, I have a friend who gets pure Chinese white delivered by courier to his flat in London, £26 a gram. It's online. You can go crazy now.
You can also get OxyContin
You can.
delivered.
Yeah, you can.
That may well be
You can get anything you want. So, but I think it's going to make the service is going to really need to change to make it much more acceptable to professionals and, say, for want of a better expression, middle class people who can access those services, who currently feel put off because of the sort of slight criminal air to the places that they have available, which is a shame. Yes?
Not a question, just a comment really. It's a fantastic presentation, I really appreciated it, and I worked most of my professional career in Bristol, and I watched this and I thought, you know, the war in Bristol's over. It's over because every single rehab in that city has been closed down.
Right.
Every single one.
Right.
And it just breaks my heart.
Yeah.
It makes me emotional, it breaks my heart. It's, you know, the people, the choices are just not there for the addicts in Bristol. It's, the war's over. It's a terrible thing, terrible.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
What will be the impact of the depot injections now?
Say again?
The depot injections, Subutex now is coming with 1 week and 1 month. Do you think that it will have a clear impact on the treatment?
Well, giving people a 1 month injection?
Yeah.
Well, it would obviously, you would stop all that need for a daily pickup and all that kind of slightly humiliating stuff that goes on. If it's Suboxone, then obviously that should produce a great deal of stability, and obviously makes it much easier to manage because you're only having to see somebody once a month. I would hope that it would be combined. Now that you've got all that time freed up of distributing methadone and stuff, you'd use that time to actually engage therapeutically with the people during that month, because hopefully just giving somebody Subutex and no therapy and no support or no ability to gain insight is not going to really progress that person. So I would hope that by giving people 1 month of whatever it is, particularly Suboxone, that should free up your workers to be able to give them some therapeutic support as well. I hope that would happen.
So hope is of interest, but
Yes.
it could be good that we can start thinking of building programs around it, exactly like you suggested.
Yes. Marie?
I've got a comment on the methadone, and I've got a question about abstinence. I was on methadone for 25 years, and all methadone enabled me to do was get well enough in the morning to go and get my money, by crime, through offending, to get my drugs. I've been sat around a lot of drug commissioners the last week, trying to get the programme set up that I'm telling you about, the abstinence-based one, and I'm coming up they're coming to me with a lot of questions. What's your view on people on medication in abstinence? So I've got somebody who I'm sponsoring now who's on diazepam for PTSD, and I'm like in my own conflict, but I'm telling him it's okay to pick up his key rings because it is prescribed.
Completely.
Yeah.
I think it's a real... there are a lot of amateur doctors in the fellowship. They become doctors the moment they get clean, and they are making incredibly dangerous statements to people, taking them off medication that people need, not giving them proper advice, and being very, very draconian. I think that's a real weakness of the fellowship, and I think it's incredibly dangerous. Yeah. But it happens a lot. Yes.
I just wanted to echo that I liked what you said about anonymity and coming out. And I haven't heard it much. And it's one, I mean, as a great fan of the fellowships, really, it's a sticking point for so many years. I just want to open my mouth and say that, really, because I just think that it's, I never really understood it, because every time that I see a celebrity that comes out, my private practice goes up. I see people in, whatever treatment, whether it's private or and I don't know why we're kind of so wedded to this, but it's
We don't even have to go public. As I said, you can tell your doctor.
yeah.
You can tell people. You don't have to go and shout it from the rooftops.
It's like that at the moment. It's like that you've gone against the holy commandment.
Yeah.
And I think that's the bit that I don't like. I'm not saying that you have to go public, but it's just that thing.
Yeah.
Because what the language it's couched in is egotistical to go public. Or however. But anyway, I just thought...
To me, that's a bit of a history lesson. My belief is that when AA was first introduced,
Yeah.
they were terrified about it being rejected
Yeah.
because of people relapsing.
Yeah.
So they really were insistent about people not going out and going, I'm going to AA, and then finding a few weeks later.
Yeah.
That argument is long gone.
I agree.
AA is accepted now. We know that some people go and some people relapse. That argument's long gone. I don't think there's anything like the need for that level of anonymity any longer. Myself. Yeah. Yes.
I think the anonymity part, it's not necessarily about the shame but if with that spike that you spoke about, it's okay. With that spike that you spoke about, part of the fear was that they wouldn't be able to meet the needs of the deluge of people that would come, because obviously there's a lot of meetings, but then people need help between the meetings as well. So I think the fear was and has been that if people would come, they won't get that help between the meetings. So that's why it was attraction rather than promotion and that sort of thing. Not
Maybe.
necessarily,
Yeah. Maybe. Yes.
Thank you. Sorry, ironically, I was speaking to a friend of mine in long-term recovery who's going to be writing about the anonymity thing, and the anonymity tradition, being the spiritual foundation, was actually put in to counter how God-based it was. It was actually a dilution of anonymity as the spiritual foundation, rather than it could have easily been God Almighty is the spiritual foundation. So there is actually going to be a written piece coming out by Grapevine around that piece on anonymity, but it is meant to dilute the God aspect.
Are they going to change the word God?
They're looking.
They're looking at it.
It has been acknowledged that there is a rewriting of the book going on in the States at the moment, because there's stuff going through the judiciary. It's obviously it's been sued a lot in America, and there was a judge that actually felt very clearly that it was a religious organisation as opposed to a spiritual one. So there has been a lot of controversy over what's in the book and the terminology. So there is actually a process ongoing at the moment to rewrite and reword those first 164 pages, which have kind of been stubbornly stuck to. But I've got a friend who's kind of in the middle of what's going on at the moment, and there are changes going on.
Well, I mean, to quote the Dead Poets Society, just because it's written in a book, don't make it true. You know. Yes.
I mean, I don't mind people saying that they're in recovery. I mean, I'm in recovery. I go to NA. I don't mind saying that in this room. But I don't like the idea of other people saying they go to, or me saying I go to NA in a public place. To say that for someone to say they're in long-term recovery and perhaps even that they're in 12-step fellowship is a slightly different thing.
Yeah.
And I do think you say that people haven't heard of it. Well, that's the whole point. So if Mr. Famous, says he's in NA one week and then drinks the next week, those people who haven't heard of NA except in the context of him, that's going to reduce the reputation of NA or AA or NA or AA or whatever fellowship he goes to. And I think that's part of the reason for anonymity. And I think it's terribly important. I get very annoyed hearing celebs, and a lot don't, and one in particular that you know doesn't say that he's in a particular fellowship, and I do respect that. But I think that line should be stood behind. I really do. I think it's very important.
I think you're absolutely right. I think we should say I'm in recovery.
Yeah.
I don't think I need to say I'm going to AA or NA, but I could say I'm in recovery.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I agree with you completely. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point about the war between harm reduction and abstinence. I think it's a lot of it comes down to resources as well. You were talking about clients, having 40 people on your caseload. I've worked in community drug and alcohol services. I had 130.
Right.
So it was just completely unmanageable. It's very frustrating for people who work in there. They want to be delivering therapeutic interventions, but they can't. And it seems to me that everything is polarised now, that the vast majority of people who will get the opportunity to go to rehab are those who can afford it.
Yep. I mean, rehab is. I mean, I think rehab is dead for people the 250,000 people on methadone. They are not going to go to rehab. I think that's you're going to be bloody lucky to get to rehab. I think the whole thing about collective voice, they get £425 million a year, the members of Collective Voice, to deliver treatment. They're bidding for contracts which are presumably have tiny, tiny markups on them. The only way they can manage to meet the contract is through having voluntary workers, a lot of whom are on methadone. It's the only way they can kind of meet the contracts. Why they aren't saying, I can't possibly deliver a service for this type of money, I don't know. But they keep on saying, no, we can deliver. And then you have the whole thing changing every 4 years. So all the staff are terrified because TUP is coming in and they're going to get shifted over to another pension scheme. So they don't concentrate for a whole year. The clients don't get any care because everybody's terrified that, I almost said it, everybody's terrified that, the whole system changes. You get to know your caseworker, then he or she is changed every 3 years. I mean, it's just chaotic. And it's also, everybody says, well, there's no NHS funding. It's not NHS. It hasn't been NHS funding for years. It's run by your local authority. My local authority are a bunch of very difficult people. And they know nothing about addiction. And yet they're, they've got far more important things to do. I just don't see any local authority increasing the amount of money they're going to spend on addicts or rehab or anything like that. I think it's becoming something that that's why I'm delighted to be part of this, because it's going to make rehab available to a whole group, different group of people that can't at the moment access it.
Fantastic. And on that note, I'm afraid we're out of time now. So please join me in saying thank you very, very much. It's been our pleasure to have Chip. Thank you very much.